Welcome. Let me go ahead and share my screen here for a moment, get us started. So if you are joining us today, you are in the session Buyouts, Risk Blindness, Rational Planning, and Reinvention. My name is Matthew Sanders. I will be your moderator today. And we're joined by an esteemed group of panelists and a presenter, one of my colleagues at the Pew Charitable Trusts. So briefly, I am Matthew Sanders. I'm a senior manager in Pew's Flood Prepared Communities program, which I'll talk about a little more momentarily. I'm joined by Matthew Fuchs, who is an officer within the same program at Pew. Jaleesa Tate with the Maryland Emergency Management Agency. Eric Letvin at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and finally, Cornelia Dean, a journalist, author, and science editor at the New York Times. So to briefly run through our agenda today, we've basically broken this down into 5 parts. I'll briefly introduce the session, as well as some of our work at Pew momentarily. Then we'll turn things over to our 3 panelists to provide introductions for themselves, as well as opening remarks. And then we'll take a block of time, and Matt Fuchs and I will run through buyouts research that Pew has led over the past 18 months or so. And then we'll turn things back over to our panelists for their reactions, insights, and comments. And finally, we'll open things up for a more open-ended and what I hope is robust discussion. So, slide didn't change. We'll move right into an introduction for the session itself. So as I mentioned, I'm with Pew Charitable Trusts and the Flood Prepared Communities Initiative. And basically our mission is to work at the federal and state level to, in very basic terms, reduce the impacts of flooding across the United States. Now, to back up for a moment, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Charitable Trust, but we're a working 501c3 NGO. We're a data-driven policy and research institution. And as we like to say, we work in a lot of different areas, from penguins to pensions, as the term goes. We are under Pew's environmental portfolio, and our specific focus, as indicated, is on flooding and adaptation therein. So within flood prepared communities, we basically have 3 lines of work. We work to change policy at the federal level, specifically around NFIP reform. But also we advocate for infrastructure improvements across the country that be ostensibly flood ready. My work is at the state scale, and so I work with state practitioners across the country to develop statewide plans that are designed to reduce flood risk now and in the future. And finally, most of our focus today is on our research component, in which we'll take specific subject areas specific to flooding, specific to flood disaster resilience, and break those down in such a way that we can get deep and provide a body of knowledge to advance the discourse. So a few things sort of laying groundwork. So at the federal level, I think everybody at this point, there's bipartisan understanding that our disaster landscape is functionally unsustainable across the country. It's hugely expensive, not to mention devastating to lives, as we have repetitive years with an increasing number of catastrophic events. And we also feel like there's a really nice opportunity at the moment with the new administration taking hold. There seems to be quite a bit of appetite. I think you all may have heard last night that there's a bipartisan agreement, hopefully on an infrastructure package. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to do some big things to, in aggregate, reduce flood risk across the country. And at the state level, we've seen states take it upon themselves to allocate resources and establish mandates either through legislative activity or executive order These are states that have stood up offices of resilience, have hired chief resilience officers, or have otherwise worked to establish some type of wide-reaching planning effort to understand risks today and into the future, and have also started to dedicate real resources to attenuating those risks. And this is sort of where we come to the buyouts work, in that a lot of the work that is happening at the state level either has directly alluded to a needed change in land use or has funded buyout activities specifically. And we as a program have a distinct understanding that, as we work to reduce flood risk across the country, land use is going to have to be an important part of that discussion. And naturally, when you start talking about land use, you start talking about the managed retreat concept writ large, and then obviously, buyouts specifically are a component, a subset of the broader managed retreat concept. So that's our interest in the topic area and why we've chosen essentially to take on buyouts as a topic of research interest. And so with that introduction out of the way, I will ask each of our three panelists to introduce themselves and to provide a few brief remarks pertaining to how they approach the work as it pertains to buyouts and managed retreat, and perhaps impart one or two big ideas that might advance our discourse through this session. So without further ado, I will ask Jaleesa Tate from the Maryland Emergency Management Agency to take the dais.
All right. Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to come and participate today and share a little bit about the work that we're doing in Maryland. So my name is Jaleesa Tate. I currently serve as the State Hazard Mitigation Officer for the state of Maryland. So essentially my primary focus at my job right now is to administer FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grant programs. And one of the large activities under those grant programs is, of course, the acquisition and demolition projects, or the buyouts, that we are here to discuss today. So in addition to that, I oversee the development and implementation of the state's hazard mitigation plan, provide guidance and technical assistance to our local communities in their hazard mitigation planning efforts, and then also look broadly across our state to identify existing kind of risk reduction measures we have in place, and then how we can better effectively utilize those as well too. So essentially in Maryland, we have not done very large scale buyouts like, 50 or 100 or more homes at one time. We have done them on a lot smaller scale as well too. And a lot of the issues that we come across is definitely in regards to community buy-in, whether it's the actual residents of that community or the elected officials. So especially in our low resource communities, there are numerous concerns from a financial perspective with regards to how can they provide that non-federal share for a lot of the FEMA grants, or else what does the impact have on the community's tax base as well too. So those are a few of the challenges that we see here in Maryland that we are constantly looking to identify different solutions with as well too. In addition to that, some of the other things that we're starting to think about is the human aspect to these buyouts as well too. For a lot of our hazardous areas within Maryland, those areas are settled by individuals who have been there for multiple generations. So of course they are very tied to their land. A lot of their employment is also based on, where they are physically located. So in a large area of Maryland, it's very dependent on fisheries, and then also on agriculture as well too. So we have to look at those different aspects and factors when we start bringing in this discussion about managed retreat, and ensuring that when we are, attempting to relocate individuals, that, they still have the possibility to carry on their livelihood. And then kind of the second thing that we've really become interested in is how do we ensure that we are always contributing something back to the community? So even though we're like physically taking away a structure that, is in a hazardous area, it might pose a danger to the community. How do we make sure that we're either providing some type of community amenity in replacement of that, or basically different kind of beneficial reuses, as I like to steal that term from our dredging programs here in the state. So just a little bit more about myself. Previous to being in this hazard mitigation space, I worked mainly in environmental land use and city planning. So I have experience in rural communities and then also in larger urban areas, such as Baltimore City, which also has a lot of different equity issues tied into a lot of the kind of community challenges that we face in those urban areas. So with that, thank you again, Matthew, for providing the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to today's session.
Thank you very much, Jaleesa. We're happy to have you on the panel today. Hold on. Every time I click on something, I lose my ability to control the presentation. So I'll ask Eric Letfin from the Federal Emergency Management Agency to provide us with a few opening remarks. Go ahead, Eric.
Great, thank you for inviting me to the panel. So just a brief overview of some of our grant programs. So I'm the Deputy Assistant Administrator in FEMA for our mitigation grant program. So we have, if you're not familiar with our grant programs, we have both pre and post disaster grant programs. So typically we spend about 80% of our 80 cents on the dollar post disaster and roughly 20% pre-disaster. So one of the, I think, challenges is that a state receives a presidential declaration and that turns on the funding for any type of mitigation grants, including acquisition. So you're working in that post-disaster stressful environment, and we certainly with our new pre-disaster mitigation grant program, building resilient infrastructure in communities, which the president just announced $1 billion for this coming year, would much rather work in that pre-disaster environment and have more thoughtful mitigation and tie the mitigation grants really better with the community, the state and local hazard mitigation plans and local zoning ordinances and things of that nature. So in FEMA, just real quick, we've spent in the history of our grant programs about $3.4 billion on acquisitions of approximately 48,000 properties. We did $132 million of acquisitions in 2019. Certainly, I wrote a paper on this over 20 years ago. I think in coastal areas, FEMA has no preference. It's up to the local jurisdiction. The way the law is set up, it's a voluntary program. So whether the homeowner wants to do an acquisition or elevation or mitigation reconstruction when they're building a new home, that is a local decision. So the locality would submit their grant application up through the state. And Jaleesa, obviously, with Maryland, she's the person in Maryland that people go to for help with mitigation grants. They administer it, and then we work with the state to support their priorities. So as long as the mitigation grant is consistent with the state and local hazard mitigation plan, we have no particular preference whether it's an acquisition or elevation or what have you. That is a local decision. And we support whatever those local and state priorities are. Certainly in, I think, coastal areas, it is with the higher property values, we've seen, elevation is typically more preferred in riverine areas. Acquisition tends to be sometimes more popular. A lot of it's tied to the land value. One thing with FEMA's acquisition programs, that property is turned over to the local community, and essentially it cannot be built on again. There's some limited allowed uses, things that are compatible with a floodplain, such as a park or a soccer field, or things of that nature. It's essentially something that's not going to generate a future flood insurance claim. So essentially, it's turned over to the local community to maintain as open space. So that is one thing I think a lot of communities consider is once that property goes through an acquisition, it really can't be built on again. It's put into the deed per our regulations. I guess I'll close with timeliness. That is certainly one thing that comes up all the time. We have generally we've approved 78% of our acquisitions within 2 years, and 93% we have approved and obligated those funds within 3 years. So on average, it's about 19 months. We would certainly love to see that number go down, especially in the post-disaster environment. People's homes are damaged and they want out, and whatever we can do to speed that up. It takes on average about 15 months for an application to go through from the local government through the state, and then like Jaleesa would send that into us, to our regional office. That on average takes 15 months. We do our approval within 4 months on average. There's certainly exceptions. We've done it within like literally weeks after a disaster, and sometimes it goes on for quite a long period of time. We would love to see what kind of work can be done to shorten that. Having property owners ready to go, before a disaster happens, certainly can speed that up. But it's certainly challenging. It's a huge decision for a homeowner to decide whether they leave their house or not. So I'll leave it there. I think timeliness is something we can work on together, federal, state, and local government.
Thank you, Eric. And finally, last but not least, Cornelia, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Whoops, what did I do?
Wait, there you go.
Oh boy. Okay. Thank you for letting me come and talk to you all. I am a science journalist, and I've been writing about the coast for decades now. My first book on coastal land use came out in 1999. It's called Against the Tide. It's still in print. Obligatory author plug. But what I want to talk about today is choices that we have been making on the coast. Often, I think, unwittingly, unknowingly. We continue to make these kinds of choices, continuing to make unknowing, unwitting choices, and they have turned into a situation that's untenable, as we know, because we're having a conversation about buyouts in the first place. Among the things that we have done over the years is we have set up a system in which we socialize the costs of unwise coastal development and privatize the profits for it. This is not just unfair, but it creates all kinds of perverse incentives. Two great examples of that are the beach renourishment programs that exist in virtually, well, I don't want to say every coastal town, but very many coastal towns in the United States. And of course, the National Flood Insurance Program, which people have been trying to drive a stake through the heart of for a long time. It's a wild socialization of costs and privatization of benefits. Also, we have basically bet our future on the coast with technologies like beach renourishment, which we now realize are not sustainable in the long term. We're looking at a potentially huge problem with that kind of thinking. And we have ignored the fabulous opportunities that we get when disaster strikes. Disasters on the coast are a real good opportunity to rethink what we're doing. And many people will say, what we should do is do that kind of thinking before the next disaster and to be ready to rock and roll when it hits. But we don't do that either. We are looking at the short term. We have a real short-term approach with the beach. This is an issue that I first learned about when I was working on that first book. And it refers to something called the Ash Wednesday storm of 1962, which obviously is like 60 years ago now. And many people, I bet, in this audience might never have heard of it. Until recently, it was what was called the storm of record on the East Coast. It was a gigantic nor'easter that stretched from Maine to Florida, and it pounded off the coast through 5 high tides. And the devastation it did on the East Coast was remarkable. It was extreme. However, there was very little development on the East Coast at that point, especially compared to what we have today. And coastal scientists who were basically forming what was still a relatively new field, they looked at it as a great research opportunity. And what they discovered was that areas of beach that were not built on, that were relatively free of development, recovered from that storm relatively quickly. The more development a stretch of coast had, the more trouble it had recovering. That was the real important lesson of that storm. And that was an opportunity to make a choice, given this information, how are we going to manage the coast? And I would argue that we made the wrong choice. Instead of saying this is a real good area that we should discourage development in, we started thinking, okay, what do we have to do to make development possible here? This was the origin of the flood insurance program, and which is, people could talk about that forever and have. I won't do that here, but in any event, this was the beginning of concentrated efforts that were not designed to incentivize development, but had the effect of incentivizing development. It was a choice we made, and it was not a good choice. One result of that is the playing out of another choice we made, which is we kind of disregard the public's right to public trust lands across the coast. The result of development on the coast in many, many, many areas is the loss of public access to the beach, which, speaking as a person who loves the beach, I think is tragic for people. So this is more or less where we were in the summer of 2012, when the Congress amazingly passed legislation to raise the rates for flood insurance and take other steps to bring what I would say is a little common sense to our regulation of the coast. The legislation passed, people started talking about how it would be implemented, and a couple of months later, Superstorm Sandy struck. And Superstorm Sandy, the Ash Wednesday storm of 1962 had been the storm of record for the East Coast all those years. It took Superstorm Sandy to wipe it out as the storm of record. And if you remember, if you were watching television even at the time, you saw people like Governor Cuomo and Governor Christie of New Jersey, Cuomo of New York and Christie of New Jersey, say immediately after the storm, we have to look at buyouts. People are living in places it's not safe to live. We must encourage buyouts. And I was quite heartened by that. I thought that was very interesting. But I thought to myself, it's not going to last. And I would say within 48 hours, the rhetoric had shifted from we need to get people out of harm's way to we need to build back bigger and better than ever. And in fact, there was a big series of public service announcements on television, advertisements on television with famous New York actors like Robert De Niro and Al Pacino and so on, saying we're going to build back, whatever it takes, we're going to build back. So this disaster, I think, although it produced a lot of action, I guess, but to me, Sandy was a missed opportunity to have a real serious discussion about how we're going to do buyouts. It was a real good chance to rethink. But anyway, so now there are choices that we could be making now, even in spite of all of this. And I wish I could say I think we were. One question that we should be looking at is the way we regulate the coast, the way we regulate land use on the coast. We have a tendency to regulate it parcel by parcel. And we regulate it according to existing political jurisdiction lines, like counties or cities or towns. We do not have an adequate understanding of the geology of the coast, which is formations, sources of sand, sediment, mechanisms that carry sediment, sinks of sand, the kind of physical structures in geology that pay no attention to political boundaries. And it's the geological formations we should be looking at when we regulate, and not the political boundaries. And we certainly should be stepping way back and not doing this parcel by parcel by parcel regulating, which is what we do now. My other suggestion for a choice, we actually have made the choice. We made the choice starting in the 60s when we embraced the socialization of costs and privatization of benefits. We need to put the market back into the picture in a big way. Because if people actually had to pay the costs that their development actually incurs themselves, I think it's very likely that we would not have as many dangerous and unwise decisions that we have now. So in the end, I mean, I think that inevitably has to happen because we've gotten to a place where things cannot go on as they are. I'm sure you've all seen about the flooding in Miami and so on. I live on Chappaquiddick, which is a small island hanging off the east end of Martha's Vineyard. And we get to Chappaquiddick on a ferry. And already now the approaches to the ferry are increasingly washed out because of rising water. The ferry can't operate because the water is too high. The road that approaches the ferry, is impassable because it's under a few feet of water. These things used to be unheard of, and now I won't say they're common, but they're staring us in the face. So, and also people's wells are being subjected to saltwater intrusion. So this is a kind of reality that is, it's no longer possible to ignore it the way we have for a long time. So in spite of all the bad news, I'm hopeful for the future. And thank you for giving me this chance to make those points.
Absolutely. Pleasure to have you join us today. I was furiously jotting notes throughout each of your comments, and so I foresee robust discussion in our near future. So thank you for those introductions. And with that, I will turn things over first to my colleague at Pew, Matthew Fuchs, to run through some of the work that we've been doing over the past year and a half or so, specific to buyouts. Switch it over.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks to the panelists and Columbia for the opportunity to have this discussion. So the reason that we undertook buyouts research is very related to our fundamental view at Pew that the US needs more disaster mitigation, and that buyouts are an important piece of the puzzle as a particularly effective form of mitigation. Over the past 2 decades, tens of thousands of buyouts of flooded or flood-prone structures have been paid for, at least in part, with federal funds, not from a single program, but from multiple federal agencies and programs. Even so, buyouts, along with other forms of mitigation, still account for a very small fraction of the overall flood-related spending. And in fact, according to a Brookings report this year, there's a 7-to-1 ratio in recovery to resilience funding. Just a little bit of background for our research and the recommendations that are going to be in our report. Two of the main departments and agencies that we've really contemplated for this report are FEMA and HUD, since they house major programs and efforts that can frequently include buyouts. But it's important to keep in mind key differences between these departments' efforts. So CDBG-DR funding may become available after a presidentially declared major disaster, but only when Congress provides a supplemental or special appropriation for recovery purposes. And while FEMA's programs have generally placed a high priority on purchase of residential properties, HUD may allow its funds to go toward commercial, agricultural, or vacant land if the purchase supports one of the national objectives required for use of CDBG funds. And another difference is data availability. FEMA has a public-facing database with some basic information about buyouts through the years, HUD, via its quarterly reporting mechanism, also gathers data on CDBG-DR buyouts, but the data is not available in an easily searchable format. Maybe the take-home here is that we know different agencies like FEMA and HUD are going to have different statutory responsibilities, therefore different programs, but we're interested in exploring federal opportunities for packaging the programs for buyout applicants in ways that make the process a little bit more straightforward. And we can go to the next slide. So this is a chart that we borrowed from NRDC. It shows the complexity of the buyout process. You can see kind of the different levels that are involved in the multiple steps at the different levels. And the purpose here is not necessarily to propose changing this process, but it could be really key to develop more mechanisms to guide states and localities through the process. And next slide. So last July, we had an expert workshop bringing together academics and subject matter experts, some local and state practitioners, for the purpose of exploring new ideas and strategic approaches for buyouts. And what we heard has been influential for developing our report and really helpful to define the problems that need to be solved. Some of the examples of things we heard were needing more innovative financing and relocation assistance. As I just mentioned, sort of the complexity of the process for buyouts, there being few incentives for buyout planning efforts, BCA methodologies needing to be more accessible, and sort of at a broader level, the narrative around buyouts needing to change, that buyout activities can be framed in a way that it emphasizes the advantages over simply emphasizing on escaping risk, which is an important piece of the issue, but there are positives sometimes when communities are able to leave areas with a lot of flood risk. And some of the additional things that we heard, there were quite a few ideas. One was greater utilization of the Uniform Relocation Act, the need to amplify trusted voices in communities that can often be influencers in deciding to undergo large buyout projects, using zoning to regulate development along the lines of incentives, the use of catastrophe bonds, which is an idea that has kept kind of popping up over the years as a potentially viable option. And then they told us about the potential for doing more to incentivize co-benefits. Next slide. And so we have undergone development of the report. It's divided between history and context to set the stage for our recommendations. And then the recommendations themselves, we have categorized under planning and funding sources and guidelines. And that's how we've organized this presentation as well. Another important thing to mention about this forthcoming report is our decision to focus on the federal level for our recommendations. And our thinking here is that although in most instances the federal government does not itself purchase properties, and HUD and FEMA don't have standing programs aimed specifically at supporting buyouts, those agencies do provide the lion's share of financial support for buyouts. And we believe there are key steps that they could take to improve the use of buyouts as part of a comprehensive approach to flood mitigation. Another important point is that this report is not focused on legislative changes. Our vision is for a set of recommendations that departments and agencies view as feasible and can implement as relatively practical measures, even though programmatic and regulatory changes can be difficult as well. And recommendations in the report are high level. They're not meant to be prescriptive, but rather ideas or areas that we recommend for departments and agencies to focus on. And with that, I will turn it over to Matt to talk about our planning section.
So as Matt Fuchs alluded to, we've contoured our findings and recommendations around two broad areas: planning for buyouts, and obviously, recommendations specific to the funding sources themselves. So first of all, I'm a planner in my own right, so that's why you're hearing me talk about the planning section. But we've organized our research and our findings around three broad themes, which I'll dive into individually momentarily. So one is to coordinate approaches, the second is to plan holistically, and the third is to support community. And I think these are all high-level concepts that I suspect everybody would agree with. But I think the nuance obviously comes into the details as to how you do these things. So we talk about coordinating approaches. So as I mentioned, I'm a planner. I would never argue that we should have fewer plans or less planning. But the reality is there are a lot of planning products that specifically speak to this buyouts topic, right? So there's FEMA hazard mitigation plans, there's HUD, CDBG action plans, there's state and local planning efforts that all broadly allude to the nexus of land use and disaster risk. But the problem is there's no real established approach within the planning world for how we should be talking about that connection between disaster risk and land uses, and how we would then correlate that back to a potential need for a comprehensive approach to managed retreat, and then more specific approaches to buyouts of residential households. So we think that there's a lot of room to streamline the respective efforts within the planning sphere, so that everybody is at least at some point talking about the same concepts, the same terminology, using the same sources of data to quantify what risk looks like, and then coordinate that with a potential buyout scenario. And at the moment, there's a lot of divergent products, sometimes within a common jurisdiction, that sometimes come to different conclusions or say things in different ways, which makes coordination almost impossible. I'll also allude to a point that I think Eric started to make in his opening remarks about the need for not only pre-disaster planning, but connecting that pre-disaster planning with a post-disaster environment. And so, obviously that's difficult to talk about the idea of a buyout, let's say, in concept before a disaster takes place. Typically what happens, a disaster occurs, somebody has their life upended, and then and only then do they really, embrace the idea that maybe they need to move to a safer locale. But to the extent that there can be more of a continuum that establishes a common approach, a set of ideas that could be carried through both pre-disaster and post-disaster, we think that's the direction that we all should move into from a planning perspective. So Jaleesa, I think, spoke to this in her remarks regarding the holistic nature of planning for buyouts, right? It's not just buying a piece of property on a particular parcel. You're talking about a social network, you're talking about an economic network, you're talking about all of the things that make up a community when you start talking about the concept of buyouts themselves, right? At some point, you're talking about transportation and supply chains, you're talking about what is functionally a negative growth concept in planning terms. So, that requires a lot of intricacy, it requires a lot of coordination. And so even if we were able to develop plans that discuss the buyouts in a coherent, complete type of way, as we sort of think about the structure of government, we often have silos at the federal government that then replicate at state and local government. So if somebody from a housing agency is contemplating a buyout activity in a particular place, they're not necessarily in coordination with a transportation agency that might be planning to invest funds in a road to service a community that may no longer be there in the future. And so one of the things that we're really pushing for through this research is the idea that we shift more toward holistic planning. We take good information pertaining to risk, we translate that into potential need for buyouts, but then we also take a multifaceted approach to think through all of the areas of community that are ultimately going to be impacted by these types of activities. So the third high-level concept that I'll broach is the idea of supporting community itself. And so, as I mentioned, as a sort of a philosophical aspect of how we do business at Pew, everything that we advocate for, everything that we research, we focus heavily on data. And we think in this case, the beginning of good community outreach and engagement has to start with good data. And so the extent to which we can leverage all of the various scientific sources of information that help us quantify risk. And I've highlighted a few here on the slide that speak to the potential for an increase in precipitation over time, and also a watershed approach to understand hydraulic and hydrology in a particular watershed basin. The extent we can take those sources of data, package it and translate it in such a way that it can effectuate a conversation within a community, we think that's the right way to calibrate activities through the research we're doing here. So in other words, we think the public is fairly intelligent in the sense that when presented with good data, with good information, most people begin to understand that, they may be living in a location that's not going to be tenable over time. But without that data, without it being presented, packaged, visualized in such a way that's accessible to communities, there's really no way to kick off the process by which a community can organize around what it understands about its risk profile and begins to develop out a plan, assume some degree of self-determination as to what's going to happen to that community as a result of the risks that it then can begin to understand. And so when we talk about supporting community, there's a lot of different ways to do that. And we think, supporting community-based organizations, supporting community networks, that's all part and parcel of what we're talking about here. But it has to start with helping the public understand, what good data looks like and what a risk profile looks like in a particular location. So with all that being said, we have a series of draft recommendations that we'll finalize and obviously elaborate on in a more robust format when we release the final Buyouts research this fall. But we're going to be speaking a lot about coordinating those approaches, and an all-of-government approach, federal, state, and local, pre-disaster, post-disaster, supporting community-led efforts to plan for, develop, and launch programs, promoting buyout plans that do account for social vulnerability, critical service needs, take that holistic approach to thinking through all of the aspects of what a buyout in a particular place may mean. Improve outreach and engagement, as I discussed, as a sort of starting with good data, but then also encouraging and funding partnerships that begin to speak to a point a few of our panelists have made that once a buyout takes place, the way federal policy is currently constructed, it has to be open space in perpetuity, which creates something of a maintenance burden for a local government. So how do we think through sharing that burden at the local level in such a way that it's not simply attached to a local government? With that, I will turn things back over to Matt Fuchs to talk about a few of our recommendations specific to funding mechanisms.
Thanks, Matt. So we, like our planning section, we have identified a series of themes for you related to funding buyouts, the other section of our report. And these themes are aligning federal agencies, rewarding success, and some of our ideas that are more creative for buyouts. That first theme, aligning federal agencies, as we've talked about, by necessity, we have different agencies with different programs. And one downside to that is that the combination of different programs can cause confusion, distrust, and delay for potential buyout participants. So we'll be recommending in our report that the federal agency leadership and staff explore establishing an interagency task force for comparable mechanism to share information and identify opportunities to make it a little bit more synced up between different program requirements. A dedicated group like this would help ensure federal consultation with state and local applicants to develop a common understanding of the full range of buyout options at the federal level. And it would also provide a channel of communication for practical, consistent, cross-program guidance to applicants. And the report will feature a series of case studies. And so we're going to mention a couple of them in this presentation. One that relates to the theme I just talked about is Portland, which is actually an example of a city that was successful in navigating multiple programs. In 1997, Portland recognized that a common solution was needed to address nuisance flooding, water quality problems, and declines in fish and wildlife. And the city began planning a multi-objective watershed project that has acquired over 106 acres of land and removed over 70 structures while focusing on nature-based solutions. Over 15 years, funding was acquired through a combination of the city's pre-disaster funds, FEMA's HMGP, and HUD's CGBDR. Although the varied funding sources enabled the program to create a really robust approach and relieve the burden from individual homeowners, it's possible that harmonizing these agency processes and requirements would have cut down on the near decade timeline for the city's efforts. And we can go to the next slide. So rewarding success is another theme in this part of the report. The idea here generally is that federal agencies, we think, could do more to reward buyouts comparable to how FEMA rewards states that complete enhanced hazard mitigation plans with more HMGP funds. Federal agencies themselves don't have full control over the resources they award to state and local grantees. That's an important point to emphasize. These funding levels are tied to disaster supplemental and annual congressional appropriations. But federal agencies do have flexibility to improve access to funds for communities that invest in effective buyout programs. FEMA has worked through its Cooperating Technical Partners program, for example, to enhance local investment in flood mapping. Could CTPs or a similar program be leveraged for partnerships that provide greater support to local buyout programs? Or could the BRIC scoring framework be designed to reward buyout effectiveness? Our report will propose the possibility of a special round of BRIC that could focus on supporting existing buyout programs. And another idea is to simplify BCA requirements for communities that demonstrate a history of effective buyouts. We have another flavor of this idea of rewarding success. And an example of the gap here is Birmingham, Alabama, a city that's been successful in acquiring flood-prone properties, largely due to the commitment of their leadership to provide full-time staff and contractors to support their program. However, as resources have become scarce in recent years, the city has downsized the program's capacity and the program's future is now in jeopardy. Next slide. And another relevant example on the topic of rewarding success comes from North Carolina, which has shown the benefit of including resilience efforts in statewide hazard mitigation planning, earning the status of an enhanced hazard mitigation plan starting in 2014 and renewed in 2018. And it's effectively granted the state an additional 5% in HMGP funding, which is translated into huge amounts of additional funding, $25 million to help 210 homeowners following Hurricane Matthew. Over 25 years, about 5,600 homes damaged by hurricanes and otherwise considered to be flood prone have been acquired in North Carolina. So we're interested in exploring whether FEMA, HUD, and other federal agencies could find additional opportunities for these sorts of rewards in the context specifically of buyouts. And next slide is creativity in the space of buyouts. There has been a lot of creativity at all levels of government in this space, but we do have a few additional ideas that we will be putting in the report as potentially important ways to provide more incentives and some different arrangements for buyouts to take place. One idea is to do more to promote life estates. Residents with deep, long-standing attachments to their homesteads and communities, they can be, especially resistant to buyouts. And in some cases, even when many other residents agree to relocate because of flooding, there can be compelling individual factors that may lead some residents to stay. Outside the realm of flood mitigation, the federal government has used life estates to acquire property for its own use, such as creation of national parks. This approach allows homeowners to remain in their homes for the rest of their lives or until they choose to leave if they grant the government a permanent interest in the estate. And this could be an especially effective strategy in communities with high rates of elderly populations for whom moving to a new location may be undesirable, or where residents enjoy strong cultural or historical ties to the land itself. The report will recommend that the federal government should explicitly allow state and local governments to use life estates as a mechanism to acquire property for buyouts. Next slide. So in summary, our draft recommendations are focused in part on aligning federal agencies' missions and goals on buyouts. This notion of doing more where possible to reward established state and local buyout programs that have track records of success. Another form of that would be relaxation of BCA requirements for buyout projects, as I mentioned a few slides ago. And last but not least, allowing and promoting the use of life estates and other creative mechanisms that could be used to support buyouts. And I will turn it back over to you, Matt.
Thank you. I think I'll go ahead and stop sharing so everybody can see our faces, although that includes my face that was built for radio. So with that being said, hold on a second, I lost, okay. I'd like to turn things back over to our panel for a moment to provide a bit of a spot reaction to the direction of our buyouts research at Pew. And so maybe I'll go in reverse order from the opening segment and start with Cornelia.
Well, I hope you won't regard this as trivial, although you may. At some point, one of the recommendations was to reframe the narrative in connection with buyouts. And I actually think that that's a problem. We speak of it as retreat. I mean, even the name of this conference is Managed Retreat. And I think there are a lot of people who just, they don't like that idea that we should be retreating. It's a kind of a thing that we're going to hold our ground, you know, that's the way that's the American thing to do, whatever. And so I'm interested in the question of how you can reframe the debate. The one thing that I keep coming back to is put the market into it. Yeah, you can stay there, but you have to pay for it yourself rather than what we have now. But I'd be very interested in hearing other people's ideas of whether they think this terminology is an issue, and if they do, how can it be reframed?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick, and I'm interested in hearing the other panelists' reactions. That was a huge point of emphasis in our expert workshop that we held last year, and there were a lot of ideas, even some creative ideas for renaming Managed Retreat to more positive sounding terms. But one thought that was shared by a number of people was the potential use for more visioning sessions and even framing those visioning sessions within communities to a more positive dialogue about how buyouts could support other important ideals of a community in reshaping in different places, but also in different ways that the community did view as more of a positive as opposed to simply framing it as a negative.
I'm just wondering if you were in of course, my perspective is the coast, but if you were in a coastal community, if you could put a group of residents together and say, suppose you were starting from scratch here, what would you like to see? And then this is a context in which maybe some of these things could be achievable.
Yeah, I'll just hop in here briefly. I mean, this is part of what we're talking about as it pertains to holistic planning. And so, you know, the idea is if somebody just shows up to a community and says, hey, you got to move, right? That's inherently negative. That's inherently going to evoke a defense response. But if you start the conversation by saying, look, I know that you have flooded out up teen times, your house is burned down because you live in a fire hazard area. you live in an earthquake zone or whatever, right? I mean, you've been significantly repetitively impacted by a particular disaster. And so if I can point you in a direction that's going to lead to a higher quality of life, superior outcomes for you, your family, your community, that I think is at least the beginning to turning the narrative on its head and talking more about an improving quality of life for a place that has been ravaged by disaster. I think I'm obviously simplifying how we do that here for the purposes of this discussion, but I think that's got to be the goal. With that, I'll open the floor to Eric.
Yeah, just a couple things. I alluded to it in my opening comments. So, our grant programs are designed to support risk reduction, the protection of lives and properties, and whether a community wants to, elevate or acquire or do, flood protection, stormwater projects, or, that is a local decision. So we have no preference on acquisitions or buyouts versus any other kind of mitigation technique, as long as it's consistent with the local and state hazard mitigation plan. So to put a preference on one activity over another would, I think, kind of undermine the statutes that create our grant programs altogether. That is a local decision. Certainly we want to see risk reduction. I mean, that is the goal of our programs overall, is to reduce the overall risk, however that's done. The one thing you talked about, Matt, is relief of benefit cost. That comes up all the time. One thing I should point out is that we do have pre-calculated benefits for a lot of our mitigation actions, and the vast majority, probably over 75% of our buyouts that we do fund, they don't even calculate a benefit cost ratio, because if it's below a certain amount, it kind of sails through with that. So the vast majority of communities don't even have to calculate a benefit cost ratio, but they still have to comply with we are required by law to have a benefit cost ratio on that. So we don't have any real decision-making space to waive it for, one type of community or another, or what have you. That would, a lot of discussion comes up in that area, but we are required by law to do that. So some of these things that you're talking about, I think, are great ideas, but they would require in the law that creates our programs.
Yeah, Eric, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to elaborate that for a moment. I mean, I think it's easy, and it often happens with people like me and NGOs like the one that I represent. We develop reports that basically say the federal government should do X, Y, and Z. But obviously, you're working under a somewhat prescriptive legal and regulatory regime at FEMA. So I'm wondering if you can speak to a minute as to the complexity of how you're trying to juxtapose a lot of different potential outcomes through your work at FEMA.
Yeah, it's a challenge. So I'll talk about there's roughly, say, $1 billion of post-disaster grant funding in Florida, $3 billion in Puerto Rico, maybe a little under $1 billion in Texas. So whether they want to do tornado safe rooms, or they want to acquire properties, or they want to do earthquake retrofits, or put generators on fire stations, post-disaster, which is the vast majority of where our funds go, that program is set up to support state priorities. So if Maryland wants to, if they want to acquire parts of Baltimore that are flood prone, or whether they want to elevate, that's their decision to do that. Pre-disaster, with our BRIC grant program, we do have some decision space to drive federal policy, and I think you have seen that. We do give points. It's a competitive program for applications that embrace nature-based solutions, embrace future risk and climate change. So with our points-based system, we do have some opportunities at the federal level, some decision space to drive certain policies over others, for partnerships, or to benefit impoverished communities. Our BRIC grant program, we received a lot of input from stakeholders when we created that. And I think in our points-based criteria, if you look at it, you will see a lot of that reflected in Apple. We're getting ready to make our announcements next month on those the first year of BRIC grants. And for year 2, we have $1 billion. So there's a lot of interest in that program.
So I want to ask you one more question, Eric, before I turn things over to Jaleesa. You made a comment in your opening statement about there's some desire, and I apologize if I get this wrong, on FEMA's part to begin to tie grants to local ordinances and land uses, which I think is a really interesting idea. Really difficult to execute, right? In the sense that, those local municipalities have domain over those development decisions. And so can you, perhaps elaborate a little bit more on your thinking at the federal agency level as to how to connect those grant opportunities with local policy action?
Yes, certainly. I'm not a planner, but we have a planning branch in FEMA. So, by law, every state local government, if they want to receive federal funds for disasters, has a state or local hazard mitigation plan. And if you haven't seen your communities, go look it up. It's typically on a website. And that what we like to see is the hazard mitigation plan tied in with all of the local planning decisions that are made on land use. And ultimately, that hazard mitigation plan should identify vulnerable areas and actions that could be taken to reduce that risk. What we would love to see, and some communities have done an excellent job at this, is to see those hazard mitigation plans be actionable. Identify, projects or actions that community can take to reduce that overall risk, and tie those plans up with our grants, ideally in the pre-disaster environment. Let's not wait for a disaster to occur for all these funds and the stress of the post-disaster. Let's make those local hazard mitigation plans more.
That's interesting. I'll be interested to see, how FEMA sort of advances its thinking and begins to connect a little more with those local government actions. Jaleesa, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Matt. There's been some really great points made already. I'll start first with kind of going over the Pew recommendations. So as far as like the planning recommendations, and I would also say tying into the funding recommendation, so coordinating these approaches for pre-disaster and post-disaster mitigation. What I found on the ground is that sometimes in our kind of urgency post-disaster to return a community back to normalcy, a lot is skipped over in the mitigation realm, right? Because mitigation actually takes time. So we do a lot of work on the front end where, we might be doing these community visioning sessions for buyouts and local hazard mitigation planning as well too. But I'll say in Maryland specifically, during the post-disaster phase, the hazard mitigation program is actually not involved immediately, oddly enough. So it's very much the public assistance FEMA personnel and then public assistance state personnel that are there immediately and start making some of those immediate disaster recommendations and decisions. And a lot of that is focused on returning to normalcy versus trying to break the disaster rebuild cycle. So I definitely think that there needs to be something to strengthen the hazard mitigation and public assistance programs, both at the federal and state level. And then as far as the aligning the different federal programs, I think that the idea of a task force is like incredible. And if I could, I would make that happen like after we got off of this call today. In our experience, so we try to leverage HMGP dollars. So under the FEMA program with some CDBG money under DHCD. And we've been trying to do this. Let's see, the application was developed in like 2017 and approved in 2018. So when it came to the actual implementation, what we discovered was that the two federal agencies are, the ones we're dealing with, are actually interpreting the Uniform Relocation Act differently. And we have to meet that requirement under both programs. So now we've kind of been in this space of a year or so where we kind of have folks from, DHCD talking to folks from FEMA about how exactly we're supposed to meet the requirements based on how each agency is interpreting those requirements. So that's been really interesting as we do try and do what for Maryland is going to be a larger scale acquisition demolition. So it's roughly about 15 mobile homes that we'll be acquiring in that space. And then the last thing that I'll leave off with was just the first comment about how to reframe this conversation about managed retreat. So in that expert work session that Pew had earlier, I think it was last year now at this point, one of the words that was mentioned, which I've started incorporating in my work now, is resettlement. I just feel like resettlement, it speaks differently. And I would also say, I think the other part of that is, are we approaching the conversation about managed retreat as a reactive approach, or are we actually approaching that as a proactive approach? And I think based on the way that you approach that, that really has a different meaning for the communities that you're approaching too, so that it doesn't feel like we are running from an issue, but that we are tackling these issues head on, and we can recognize, hey, either due to impacts from climate change, or whatever the case may be, we are proactively now choosing to resettle further inland and out of these hazardous areas. So I think that's also a way, again, to reframe the conversation and start to build better community buy-in.
Thanks, Jaleesa. I forgot to mention that Jaleesa was an all-star member of our expert workshop. Thus the invitation, partly the reason behind inviting her for this panel. Thanks, Jaleesa.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for all of your comments in reaction to sort of our demoing our ongoing buyouts research work at Pew. With that, I know I'm a minute over on the 25 minutes I promised to open things up for a more robust, full discussion, including the audience. I don't exactly know how that works logistically, but okay, here we go. We've got some questions coming in. Jaleesa, can you discuss the human aspects of buyouts? How can people's historical connection to the land be taken into account in buyout programs? How can communities own land use changes? How can communities own land use changes to be more resilient?
All right, yeah. So particularly in Maryland, we have a lot of small islands within the Chesapeake Bay, which are inhibited. And you all may have heard of them, like Smith Island is in Maryland, and then Tangier Island is one that's made national news in recent years, and that's actually in Virginia. So these are communities in which, they are probably like 5-6 generations deep that they've been settled here. And although, yes, they know that they are very much right in the pathway of harm and everything, and there have been in the past a lot of huge initiatives to, pay them for their land and do a buyout and have them relocate to the mainland. And there's been very, very strong opposition against that. And so I think from, a public servant perspective, those all at the local, state, and federal level, I think the best way for us to take into consideration all of that is that we are actually having a conversation with communities. So I always say we should take our data, look at what the feasible solutions might be, and then we present that portfolio of options to the community. And that's when we start having community visioning sessions, so they can, give us more insight into what works for them, what does not work for them, things we have not taken into account because we might not live directly in those communities. And so I think instead of saying, hey, this is what we've come up for you, this is your buyout package, we have those conversations with the community, from the very get-go, to make sure that they're included in this process. And so not only are they engaged, but they're actually empowered in that decision for the community as well, too.
Yeah, and I would just sort of harken back to one of the recommendations that Matt Fuchs made regarding, our promotion at Pew of enhanced use of life estates within buyout programs. And, the idea behind that is, a buyout isn't necessarily right for everybody, right? I mean, in some respects, you might have an elderly population for which, moving is not a logistical, or reasonable outcome. And so if the objective is to acquire a parcel and improve the floodplain by removing whatever's developed on it, part of what we're alluding to is the idea that, maybe from a temporal perspective, it doesn't need to be an immediate transaction. If the goal is a long-term goal, can there be a mechanism to acquire a piece of property by which at a later date, it's ultimately cleared and restored to nature? So with that said, I'll move on to the next question. So someone asks, my son and I own a small property with no building in Rumby. Can we be bought out by FEMA? And so I will turn this over to both Eric and Jaleesa, and perhaps you can talk through, if somebody wants a buyout, like what are the steps that people would typically need to take, and what does eligibility look like? I suspect that's salient to the question regarding a small property with no building.
Yeah, perhaps Jaleesa, if you want, so I actually get letters like this all the time that people write to their Congress, members of Congress, and they get sent to me. I turn them back over to the state hazard mitigation officer, people like Jaleesa. So we have our pre-disaster grants that I alluded to, but how much post-disaster funding currently exists in each state and whether those dollars are spoken for, my standard letter back for people asking is talk to your state hazard mitigation officer. And up on our webpage, we have all of their names and contact information. So if a homeowner in Maryland wants to, potentially acquire, get a property acquired or elevated or what have you, we turn them over to the state.
Yeah, so when we look at those, so the primary focus, right, our number one priority is always going to be to remove like a currently lived in structure from harm's way. So that is what we're going to prioritize first. And so like Eric was saying, depending upon how much funding might be available or something like that, you could either maybe like make that priority list that year if we have space, or potentially not because you don't have a current structure there, because our focus is primarily going to be, people, property, and in the environment first. So we definitely look at that. We would look and see if your undeveloped property is adjacent to another developed property, and then we could do like a buyout for both pieces of that land, so that we don't end up what they say is like patchworking a community, and that we're actually acquiring contiguous parcels, so that we're able to just be more effective in the land that we are acquiring. So depending upon your community where you live and stuff, as we've kind of discussed with these programs, there are different levels you'll have to go through as far as like the priority. So first with your local community to make sure, this is a priority, then at the state level, and then when we submit that final FEMA application, the application to FEMA, looking at that as well too.
Okay, is there any work at the federal government level that's looking at managed retreat, land use, infrastructure planning for natural hazards beyond coastal and riverine flooding? I suspect this speaks to a more all hazard approach, but that's sort of speculation in my point.
Man, that's an awful good question. So I worked in the White House during the Obama administration, and this question came up: should there be a federal policy on managed retreat? And we talked about it. I don't think I'm not sure where it all went, if anything was published on that. We certainly talked about it. What this administration is doing, looking at that issue, there's a lot of very talented people that have been brought into the White House and the federal agencies. So I imagine there's discussion, but I don't know of any overall strategy. I know there's a climate strategy that they're working on, but I don't know how managed retreat fits in with the climate change goals of the current administration.
Can I just
Absolutely.
one little thought in? I don't know where this is going, if anywhere, but I have heard people talk about establishing some kind of insurance program that would be analogous to the flood insurance program, for people in fire hazard zones in the West. And what will happen with this idea, if anything, I don't know. But in many ways, the situations are analogous in that people are increasingly building in highly dangerous areas, and people are losing the private insurance industry is canceling insurance policies.
Cornelia, we'll stay with you for the next question. You argue that we socialize the cost of unwise postal and privatize the profits. How would you change programs like NFIP to encourage resiliency instead of recklessness?
I think, well, if I guess, what can I say? First of all, I'm a journalist, so I have no opinions about anything, right? But if I were queen of the world, I would say to people who have those policies, you have one more claim. And after that, we're done with you. And if you choose to stay there and take the risk yourself, God bless. But the taxpayers can't afford to cover this any longer. Especially, I would say this is for the relatively small number of properties that produce the majority of claims, many of them, many repetitive claims over the years. But I think this is one of those areas where if you, the market would make changes that we find politically very difficult to make, because quite a lot of the time the people who are the strongest voices for the policy status quo are well connected, maybe they have a certain amount of money, whatever, and that kind of torques the conversation. Also, there are a lot of I think misunderstandings about the environmental, the economic benefit of some of these programs. And one area of academic research that is, I guess I can't say it's getting going, it's been going for a while, but there's room for a lot of research, which is environmental economics. And how did these money issues actually play out on the ground? And I think if we had a better understanding of that it's possible that if we knew more about those processes, our thinking might change a little bit. I don't know. That's only my guess.
I just want to follow up for a moment on your proposal for one more claim and you're done. How would you juxtapose sort of the construct of somebody that is repetitively filing small claims, initial water in their basement, what have you, compared to more catastrophic types of flooding events that are going to be more costly to the taxpayer?
Well, I often say this about myself. I can speak with confidence because I have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. So I'm unfettered by actual information. The truth is, I have no idea how such a thing would be implemented, and probably it wouldn't be implemented like that. But I think there needs to be a way to let people know that this program it's not sustainable long-term. It's a huge unfunded liability that the federal government has. I have heard people say second only to Social Security. I don't know if that's true, but in any event, it's a gigantic unfunded liability. And we acquired this liability, which is in the trillions, at a time when sea level was only starting to rise. And the rise in sea level is only going to make this worse and worse and worse. So I would say it's time to have a conversation about what are we going to do about this, because what we have now is not sustainable long-term.
I think I skipped over a question. Apologies to whomever submitted it. Matt, you mentioned a 7-to-1 ratio in recovery to resilience spending. How can we start to balance out this funding?
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting question. One idea that it's an interesting question in of itself. Should we balance it, or what's the right balance? That's a question that we've sort of struggled with. What is the right amount of pre-disaster mitigation, pre-disaster buyouts? But one additional idea for more pre-disaster mitigation, including buyouts, that we think has a lot of potential is the disaster deductible policy. that has been proposed by FEMA in the past. The idea here is that states could do qualifying mitigation activities prior to disasters, and as a result, receive more public assistance money following disasters. And that would be kind of like a particularly effective but potentially controversial way of incentivizing more pre-disaster mitigation. It would really have to be done in a way that's sensitive to post-disaster needs, as we've heard from states when this idea has been proposed in the past. That's just one idea. I mean, Eric, not to put you on the spot, but in terms of shifting to pre-disaster activity, I'm curious, what do you think the appetite is like these days at FEMA or in the federal government for something like a disaster deductible policy?
That's a good question. I mean, we have a new administrator, and I can talk about under Administrator Fugate, you mentioned we had the disaster deductible policy. Under our last administrator, Brock Long, was a lot of discussion about removing, I think it's category C for public assistance, which is public buildings. Like, shouldn't those properties be insured by the state and local governments, and rather than wait for a disaster declaration to rebuild those? So I think there's always we get under a lot of pressure from Congress and in the White House, always looking for ways to reduce disaster costs. And so how you do that, whether it's the formula that you use to declare a disaster, that per capita basis or what have you, there's always, we're always looking at new and creative ways of driving actions like that. So I don't know, again, our administrator just testified yesterday. She's new, and I'm sure that these are the kind of discussions that we're going to be having in FEMA is to relook at these kinds of things and what options do we have available to us.
Matt, back to you. Can you speak more about innovative financing and cat bonds and how these might help alleviate the timing problem mentioned by a few of the panelists?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in what the panelists think about cat bonds. That was one of the many incentive ideas that people talked about during our expert workshop, and it is an idea that just doesn't seem to really go away. It's been around certainly over the years, and a lot of people have talked about it. Now, there are other interesting ideas. One is, more effective use of loans, and we at Pew have long supported the concept of state revolving loan funds in the pre-disaster mitigation space that would include buyouts, comparable to the EPA's Clean Water SRF that has been around, I think, since the late 1980s and has been considered, for the most part, to be a successful program. But, the idea here is that federal loans, or actually a grant, goes from FEMA to capitalize state funds, and then states could provide a 20% match to capitalize this state revolving fund, and then the state gives low interest loans for projects of a variety of different mitigation types, similar to the mitigation activities that FEMA would support through its grant programs. And so that's one idea. I don't know. So there is the Storm Act, which we were really excited for how that created a state revolving loan fund program. We've also thought about a fund that would be specific to flooding. The one through Storm Act is all hazards. But yeah, I would open it up to the other panelists and Matt for your ideas too on cat bonds or other sort of creative, innovative financing mechanisms.
I'll throw one more idea into the hat. A number of states and municipalities have started entering into parametric insurance policies. The idea being, when it rains more than X, when you have a storm surge event greater than Y, you get an immediate payout on the insurance policy to address immediate needs that would, theoretically be tied to those types of events. So, I do think, sort of the timing of capital in some ways is just as important as the volume of capital that becomes available following a disaster event. And that, appears to be at least one mechanism to at least free up funds in an immediate term to take immediate action. I'm not familiar with any payouts on parametric policies actually being devoted specifically to buyout activities. But I think it'd be an interesting idea. But with that, I'll open things up to the panel. Cornelia?
Like, yes, related question. And this is actually a true story. Years ago, I attended a conference in which an insurance commissioner from a state I will not name was asked to describe the catastrophic insurance policy program the state was initiating. And the funds in the event of payouts were going to come from all policyholders of homeowners insurance in the state. They were going to be assessed, whatever the costs were going to be. And someone in the audience asked this commissioner what was their plan in the event of hurricanes, which would be a huge hit on this fund. And this insurance commissioner actually said, and I'm not making this up, our plan is there will be no hurricanes. And I am not a finance person, but I see these kinds of things and they start to look like imaginary money to me. And at the end of the day, the bill is eventually going to be presented to the taxpayers. And I would be very interested to hear people here who know way more about this than me talk about what their view is of the ultimate fairness of this kind of thing.
So there are a few questions here that speak to the question of equity, and with us coming close to the end of our time here, I'd like to sort of address that topic, wholesale, in the sense that, so there's a question about how we're accounting for equity within the context of our forthcoming research report at Pew. And also there's a question about, how can the federal government support engaging communities in an equitable way? I know, equity is sort of a big topic at FEMA at the moment. So I'd like to just open up the floor to comment on the juxtaposition of equity, disaster risk, buyout activities, and the like.
I can kick us off here. So I think, right, it's no secret that disasters, they basically widen existing disparities in communities. And so I feel like kind of as people in this disaster recovery space, then we are charged with, well, what are we doing to actually address this issue, right? So in Maryland right now, we are actually our state hazard mitigation plan is with FEMA currently for review. And so we'll adopt that in August. But one of the mitigation actions we've included within that plan is to actually conduct an equity audit of our policies and programs, right? So that we can look at how we're actually administering programs, so we can establish a baseline. And then we can go back and do the work that we need to do to ensure that we are administering our programs with an equity lens, and that we are not contributing to kind of making these gaps even larger. So I think that's one thing that we are doing. I would also say for us with our FEMA regional representatives, we've also started these conversations about how do we administer these programs in an equitable manner. And then also they've been doing a lot of listening to the states, which is really nice to kind of see where are there built-in inequities within the programs that it just might not seem very apparent. So I would say, I really truly feel like we've been doing a lot of collaboration with FEMA when it comes to equity, and then also just independently at the state level, looking at, okay, we need to develop a starting point, and then we need to make sure that we implement all the things that we are learning to make sure that we're not contributing to the issue.
Any other takers? Yeah, I think it came up maybe during the plenary on Tuesday. We currently have a request for information out there on equity. And a number of people have already commented on it. And we have executive orders written to equity. So it is no question a big part of our programs going forward. And we are relooking at our programs and how can we deliver them in a more equitable fashion, including our mitigation grants.
Okay, I think we're just about at time. Eric, there was a question from someone at NOAA that I think was specific to you. Perhaps you can follow up offline. And there is a final question about sort of the broader affordability crisis, the experiences of renters and evictions during disaster risk as blind spots. So I would just simply point to sort of the experience of Lake Charles, Louisiana last year in my home state as maybe a place to look at. A lot has been written about, what happens when a place that is suffering from some of the various issues that are alluded to then gets repetitively affected by major disaster events. So with that, I want to thank the panel. I think this has been a really interesting, insightful conversation. Thank you for everybody in the audience that provided questions. And this has been a really great experience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.